Good evening. On this channel, I tell stories of real samurai who lived in Japan's Sengoku period. Every person you will hear about truly existed. This series was originally produced in Japanese, but direct translation often fails with Japanese historical terms and cultural ideas, so this video has been rewritten and re-edited for an international audience. If anything is unclear, please tell me in the comments. I'll improve future videos. Tonight's story is about Madara Naotaka. He is not widely known, yet his final moments on the battlefield are remembered as something extraordinary. Why did he refuse to retreat? Why did he fight to the very end? Now, let us begin.
It is said that in the violent history of the Sengoku period, Japan's age of warring states, there was no battle as bloody and fierce as this one. It was June of the year 1570. The dry riverbed of the Anagawa, located northeast of Lake Biwa in present-day Shiga Prefecture, lay under a heavy, overcast sky. A damp humidity clung to the skin of the armored warriors, and even the murmur of the river seemed to hold its breath, fearing the slaughter to come. Here, the allied forces of Oda Nobunaga and Tokugawa Ieyasu stood poised against the coalition of Asakura Yoshikage and Azai Nagamasa. Tens of thousands of soldiers from both sides glared at each other across the river. The tips of countless spears shimmered under the dull gray sky, and in the tense atmosphere, only the sharp neighing of horses rang out. Everyone waited with bated breath for the first blow to be struck. In that moment of extreme tension, a thick cloud of dust rose from the Asakura camp, creating a strange, living presence that seemed to breathe apart from the rest. From beyond the cloud of dust, a single commander emerged. The size of his silhouette was clearly different from the soldiers around him. Even from a distance, he was an extraordinary giant. With every step he took, the gravel of the riverbed seemed to crunch under his weight. The air around him felt heavy and sunken, radiating an intimidating aura less like a human and more like an origami. A fierce deity descended from the mountains. His name was Madara Naotaka. He was a monster within the Asakura clan, rumored to possess unrivaled strength in the northern lands. It is said his height well exceeded 2 meters. Considering the average height of the time, he was a giant that men had to crane their necks to see. Heavy armor painted in black covered his rock-like physique, and the sharp glint in his eyes beneath his helmet shone as if to pierce through the tens of thousands of enemy troops on the opposite bank, all on his own. However, what transfixed people's eyes more than anything else was the great sword he carried on his shoulder. It was a length that defied common sense, said to be nearly 3 meters long in total. Beside it, an ordinary katana would look like a mere child's toy. This was the Tarodachi. This massive lump of iron, beyond human wisdom, was a symbol of destruction that only the chosen could wield. A murmur spread among the soldiers of the Oda and Tokugawa clans. "What is that? That's not human. No one could possibly swing such a thing." Whispers, mixed with fear and shock, rippled through the ranks like waves. Even the Asakura soldiers, who should have been his allies, could not help but feel a sense of awe at his figure. Naotaka, indifferent to the gazes around him, simply stared quietly at the battlefield. Naotaka exhaled sharply. His white breath dissolved into the damp air. He slowly lowered the Tarodachi from his shoulder and re-gripped the hilt with both hands. The leather creaked with a tight, grinding sound. In that moment, an illusion took hold, as if all sound had vanished from the world. Every muscle in his body leaped into action, and visible power poured into the great sword, a quiet signal for the tragedy about to begin. Just as the tip of his blade pointed to the heavens, the flow of time seemed to stretch slowly. The rising dust and the banners swaying in the wind all appeared to freeze in slow motion. Reflected deep in his eyes was not just the enemy before him, but the long, steep road that had led him here. The story traces back to a distant day in a snowy mountain village in the north, where a young boy first awakened to his monstrous strength. The setting is Ekizen. This province, corresponding to present-day Fukui Prefecture, is a harsh land closed off by deep snow in winter. Cold winds blowing from the Sea of Japan dye the mountains white, and the perseverance of people who spend half the year in snow and ice has cultivated the spirit of this region. The terrain of intricate mountains and valleys also serves as a natural fortress, rejecting invasion from the outside. In this harsh, yet beautiful nature, the story of Megara Naotaka begins. Ekizen during the Warring States period had developed a unique culture under the rule of the Asakura clan. However, for those living in the mountainous areas, life was by no means glamorous. They were known as kokujin, provincial locals who lived a semi-agricultural, semi-military life, farming in peacetime and taking up arms in war. Days spent side by side with nature's fury fostered strong legs and spirits. In such a mountain village, an exceptionally large baby gave his first cry. This was the future Megara Naotaka. From the time he was old enough to understand the world, Naotaka was already different from the children around him. Simply put, he was massive. When standing next to neighborhood children, the difference was like that of an adult and a child. His appetite was also tremendous, devouring served barley rice in the blink of an eye. His parents had to work hard in the fields every day just to fill this child's bottomless stomach, but what he possessed was not merely an appetite. One day, the adults of the village were transporting timber cut from the mountains. On a road muddy from melting snow, a cart got its wheels stuck and wouldn't move. Even with several adults pushing and pulling, the wheels only sank deeper into the mud. Naotaka, still just a boy, happened to pass by. Assessing the situation, he wordlessly went around to the back of the cart. Then, before the dumbfounded adults, he displayed an unbelievable spectacle. Naotaka hooked his arms thick as logs onto the cart and planted his feet firmly. He wore a ferocious expression unsuited to his young face. In the next instant, kicking up mud, the cart lifted as if it were floating in midair. Warrior! With a short shout of spirit, he dragged the cart out of the mire all by himself. The adults were lost for words, left only to stare open-mouthed at the scene. It was no longer the strength of a human child. This child is no ordinary person. The village elder looked at Naotaka with eyes mixing fear and expectation. Will he become a general whose name roars across the land, or will he become a demon? Rumors spread quickly, and people gathered from neighboring villages just to catch a glimpse of the boy with superhuman strength. However, Naotaka himself did not seem to think his power was anything special. Before long, these rumors reached the ears of the Asakura family, the lords of the region. It was a talent too precious to leave smoldering in a mountain village. His father called Naotaka to him and spoke with a serious face. Your strength is not meant only for tilling fields. Go to Ichijodani. It was a farewell to the village where he was born and raised, and an entrance into the blood-soaked world of war. Naotaka nodded silently and left home with few belongings, aiming for the Asakura stronghold known as the Little Kyoto of the Hokuriku region. A different world spread out before Naotaka's eyes as he descended the mountain. This was Ichijodani, the headquarters of the Asakura clan. In a basin surrounded by mountains, orderly rows of townhouses modeled after the capital of Kyoto stretched out. Bustling markets, beautiful mansions, and merchants and craftsmen coming and going. This city, home to 10,000 people, boasted some of the greatest prosperity in Japan at the time. For the country-raised Naotaka, it must have been a dazzling sight. Naotaka was hired as an Ashigaru foot soldier for the Asakura family, but he immediately faced a new problem. There was no equipment that fit him. The spear provided was far too thin for his hands. The armor was too cramped to contain his massive body. Above all, when he swung a wooden sword in training, he would smash his opponent's wooden sword along with it. His power was simply outside all standards. "Hey, did you break it again? Give me a break, or are you a monster?" His colleagues looked at Naotaka with exasperation. He had no bad intentions, but the concept of holding back was difficult for him. If he used his full strength, weapons broke. If he held back, his movements became dull. Naotaka felt he was too much for himself to handle. At this rate, rather than being useful on the battlefield, he feared he would become a burden. He wanted a weapon that allowed him to unleash 100% of his power. A sturdy partner he could swing with all his might, without hesitation. On his days off, Naotaka began visiting blacksmiths in the castle town. However, everywhere he went, they shook their heads. "It's a waste of iron to make such a huge sword. Even if I made it, who could swing it?" The craftsman's reactions were cold. It happened one day when he was on the verge of giving up. He found a lonely, weathered smithy on a deserted street on the outskirts of town. The heavy sound of a hammer, clang, clang, echoed from within. As if drawn by something, Naotaka passed through the shop curtain. Inside the dimly lit earthen floor filled with heat and the smell of iron, an old man was silently striking metal. The old man's name was Muneshige. He was a veteran swordsmith with 50 years of experience, known for his stubbornness. He didn't move an eyebrow even upon seeing Naotaka's giant frame. "If you're just browsing, go home. I choose my customers." Contrary to his blunt words, his eyes shone sharply as if assessing Naotaka's physique. Naotaka confided his troubles. He wanted a weapon that wouldn't break, a weapon that could withstand his power. After listening to the story, Munishi gave a dismissive snort. "There is no sword in this world that fits you." As Naotaka fell into despair, the old man grinned and continued. "Not an ordinary sword anyway, but I do have a failed creation." Muneshige jerked his chin toward the corner of the workshop. There, a long, cloth-wrapped bundle sat leaning against the wall, covered in dust. Naotaka approached fearfully and untied the cloth. What appeared was a giant, great sword unlike anything he had ever seen. The blade alone was over 5 shaku, and including the hilt, it was 7 shaku and 8 sun, an object exceeding 2 meters and 30 centimeters. It was perhaps closer to an iron pillar than a sword. The black, gleaming blade radiated a presence that was almost bewitching. "I forged it in a moment of madness when I was young," Muneshige spoke nostalgically. "Since no one could lift it, it's been sleeping here as just scrap iron. I was thinking of melting it down to make hose." Naotaka reached for the hilt of the great sword. The sensation of the leather seemed to stick to his hand. The thickness of the hilt fit perfectly into his large palm. "All right." With a short shout, Naotaka drew the great sword in one motion. The air trembled with a low thrum. It was a weight that an ordinary person couldn't even lift. Yet Naotaka's arm didn't waver in the slightest. Rather, that weight created a pleasant sense of stability. It was a sense of unity, as if his arm had simply extended. Muneshige's eyes opened wide. "Don't tell me. You're going to hold it with one hand?" Naotaka lightly spun the great sword over his head and stopped it perfectly. The sound of cutting wind roared through the narrow workshop. It was a movement so brilliant, it made the weapon seem weightless. In this moment, Naotaka was convinced. This is it. This is the other half I have been seeking. "Take it." Muneshige's voice was trembling. "I don't need money. That thing was born for you." For a swordsmith, nothing is happier than seeing the moment his creation meets its true master. "Give it a name." Something that sounds exceptionally strong. Naotaka nodded while stroking the great sword lovingly. Tarodachi, my brother, the eldest son. Thus, Megara Naotaka and the Tarodachi met. It was not merely the acquisition of a weapon, but the beginning of a legend. When he walked carrying that great sword on his back, people in the town would turn around and clear the path. Even in the Asakura clan's military exercises, its power was demonstrated to the fullest. Everyone was stunned by the sharpness that cut not only wooden shields but even logs in two with a single stroke. Then, the opportunity came to make his name known to the world. It was when the shogun, Ashikaga Yoshiaki, visited Ichiodani, relying on the Asakura clan. Yoshikage planned a martial arts demonstration in the Lord's presence to welcome the shogun. The one chosen for this was Asakura's strongest man, Megara Naotaka. Amidst the lineup of dazzling court nobles and warlords, Naotaka stepped forward carrying the Tarodachi. A stir arose from the seated crowd. Is that a spear? No, it's a great sword. How does he intend to swing such a massive object? Amidst the gathering skepticism, Naotaka bowed and took his stance. The air around him alone snapped tight with tension. Naotaka began to swing the Tarodachi over his head like a windmill, round and round. The roaring sound of the wind cutting through the air echoed throughout the palace. Oh, magnificent! Even Shogun Yoshiaki leaned forward, captivated by the sight. The great sword, which should have been heavy, danced as lightly as a willow branch. This was not merely a display of brute strength, but the pinnacle of refined martial arts. When Naotaka's performance ended, thunderous applause broke out. There is a Megara in the Asakura house. That name spread to other provinces through the guests who witnessed it. With the Tarodachi in hand, Naotaka was invincible. However, the times would not let him remain a mere performer. A man named Oda Nobunaga from Owari was rapidly expanding his power. The rough waves of the warring states were mercilessly washing toward peaceful Ichiodani. The day was approaching, moment by moment, when Naotaka and his Tarodachi would have to prove their true worth in blood. Back at home, Naotaka carefully maintained his sword. He oiled the blade and gazed into the unclouded steel. His face, reflected in the mirror-polished iron, did not bear the proud expression from the martial arts demonstration. It was a grim look, like one listening to distant thunder. Perhaps he had a premonition that this sword would soon drink the lives of hundreds, even thousands. "Father!" A young boy called out to Naotaka's back. It was the future Megara Takamoto. "When I grow up, will I be able to hold a big sword like that?" Naotaka turned and patted his son's head with his large hand. "Ah, you will. You are my son after all." Those words were an expression of hope for his son, but at the same time, an invitation to a cruel destiny. The peaceful days of the Asakura did not last long. Nobunaga's shadow was stretching to the borders of Ekizen. Skirmishes near the border increased, and Naotaka was frequently sent to the front. Every time the Tarodachi was swung on the battlefield, enemy soldiers fled in terror. "Megara is coming!" That single phrase was enough to break the enemy's formation. Naotaka came to be revered as the guardian deity of the Asakura family. Yet, a touch of anxiety lingered in his heart. His strength was effective. The Tarodachi was the strongest. But the indecisive attitude of his lord, Asakura Yoshikage, cast a shadow over everything. The storm was right there, yet the clock in Ichijodani seemed to have stopped. We must touch upon the character of the Lord Naotaka served, Asakura Yoshikage. In the midst of a warring world, he was a rare man of culture. He loved Kemari, ancient football, composed poetry, and practiced painting. He was more like an elegant nobleman than a rough warlord. Under his rule, the province of Echizen enjoyed peace. But perhaps that was nothing more than the calm before the storm. The Asakura stronghold, Ichi Jodani, was called the Little Kyoto of the Hokuriku. This was because nobles and monks fleeing the capital of Kyoto brought culture and art with them. It was a town where elegant music flowed, and the scent of incense drifted in the air. It seemed like a completely different world from the blood and mud of the Sengoku period. Naotaka existed as a symbol of martial power to protect this beautiful city. Behind the shadow of glamorous culture, mighty military force was always necessary. Yoshikage relied on Naotaka's extraordinary valor. As long as Naotaka is here, Asakura is secure. The Lord said this at every opportunity and favored Naotaka. For Naotaka, Yoshikage was a lord to whom he owed a debt of gratitude. However, there was also an indescribable frustration within Naotaka's chest. It seemed that Yoshikage's eyes were always turned toward the capital and its culture, ignoring the creeping threat of other provinces. There was a man who always supported Naotaka by his side, his younger brother, Megara Naozumi. He had a large physique similar to his brother, but was a size smaller than Naotaka, and his movements were sharper for it. In contrast to his brother, who was bold and impulsive, Naozumi was calm and composed. He constantly surveyed the entire battlefield, setting the stage so his brother could rampage freely. Truly, the Megara brothers were a perfect combination of the hard brother and the soft brother. "Brother, you're swinging the sword too much. The edge is chipped." After practice, Naozumi inspected his brother's sword with an exasperated look. "Gahaha, sorry. I put too much power into it." When Naotaka scratched his head, Naozumi sighed but took out a whetstone. The younger brother handled everything from maintaining his brother's weapons to managing the unit's logistics. Naotaka could be a hero precisely because this brother was there. And there was one more young warrior chasing Naotaka's back. Naotaka's heir, Megara Takamoto. Though still in his early 20s, he possessed a blessed physique inherited from his father. His eyes burned with hope for the future and ambition. "Father, in the next battle I will lead the vanguard." At his son's brave words, Naotaka narrowed his eyes. "Do not be impatient for glory, Takamoto. Life is the seed of everything." When Naotaka admonished him, Takamoto pouted in dissatisfaction. "I heard you were reckless when you were young, father. It's fine for me, but you are the man who will carry the next generation of Asakura." Strict but warm words from a father. The conversation between parent and child around the bonfire was a moment that softened the savage atmosphere of the battlefield. This family circle was, for Naotaka, the thing he had to protect above all else. However, the times would not give them rest. Skirmishes in the borderlands with neighboring countries had become a daily occurrence. One day, an urgent report arrived that a mountain castle was under attack. "Megara unit, move out!" At Naotaka's single command, the sturdy soldiers of Ekizen rose up. They were the elite of the elite, raised watching Naotaka's back. The battlefield was a steep mountain path. The enemy used the terrain to drop arrows and rocks. An ordinary army would have been halted, but the Megara unit was different. Naotaka, leading the way, advanced while deflecting flying rocks with the flat of his great sword. "Is he a monster?" enemy soldiers screamed. Naotaka's existence itself was like a moving castle wall. "Brother, from the right!" Naozumi's voice flew from the rear. Without looking back, Naotaka flashed the Terodachi to the rear right. With a heavy thud, an enemy soldier hiding in the bushes was blown away. It was perfect coordination, like breathing in unison. Even in mountain warfare, with poor visibility, there were no blind spots in the brothers. Teamwork. Takamoto also wielded his spear to protect his father's flank, showing work that belied a young man in his first battle. When the enemy's main force appeared, Naotaka truly showed his mettle. "Move aside!" With a roar, the Terodachi swept horizontally. With that single blow, 3 spears were broken, and 2 enemy soldiers were cut in two, armor and all. Fresh blood sprayed like a mist. The spectacle was less like a battle, and more like a massive natural disaster passing through. Terrified, the enemy threw down their weapons and fled. The battle ended as the setting sun dyed the mountains red. Naotaka was wiping his blood-stained sword with a cloth. "I cut again today." That mutter contained deep fatigue rather than the joy of victory. Though hailed as a hero, he was a gentleman at heart. He knew the weight of taking a life better than anyone. That is exactly why he had no choice but to become a demon on the battlefield. "Boss, good work." The subordinate soldiers ran up with water and rice balls. They adored Naotaka more as a reliable oyabun, a father figure, than a superior officer. "Oh, are you guys hurt? You did well." Naotaka patted each of them on the shoulder, offering praise. Sometimes he would split his own rice ball to share with a hungry young man. Those large hands were not just for defeating enemies, but for protecting and cherishing his comrades. "As long as the boss is here, we won't lose." Such words became like a password among the soldiers. But Naotaka knew. The era where one could win, with individual valor alone, was coming to an end. Rumors spoke of a man in the distant land of Owari who had gathered a massive number of new weapons called teppo, arquebuses, and used completely new tactics. The name Oda Nobunaga was growing louder day by day. When they returned to Ichijodani, the same elegant time flowed as always. Yoshikage was pleased with Naotaka's battle results and invited him to a tea ceremony to reward him. In a room drifting with the scent of matcha, Naotaka sat, shrinking his large body uncomfortably. "Splendid work. The border should be quiet for a while with this." Looking at Yoshikage's satisfied face, Naotaka felt an unspeakable anxiety. "My lord does not understand. What is happening at the border now is not a mere skirmish. The wave of the era is right there." On the way home from the tea ceremony, Naotaka looked up at the night sky. The moon was about to be hidden by black clouds. "A storm is coming," he muttered to himself. It wasn't just about the weather. A massive storm was coming to uproot the ancient, great tree that was the Asakura family. A typhoon named Nobunaga had set its course for Ekizen. The wind blowing from Owari smelled of scorched iron. Oda Nobunaga, the man once laughed at as a fool, had transformed into an existence feared as the demon king of the sixth heaven. He defeated Imagawa Yoshimoto at Okehazama, conquered Mino, and was ascending to Kyoto with crushing force. Even to the ears of Naotaka and his men in Ekizen, rumors of how defying common sense Nobunaga's army was had arrived with terrifying credibility. According to rumors, Nobunaga's way of fighting completely ignored the pride and traditions of the samurai. He chose any means to win and showed no mercy to those who resisted, even women and children. His cruelty, fearing neither God nor Buddha, made the people of Asakura, who were steeped in elegant culture, tremble. He is like a god of destruction. The officers and soldiers of Ichijodani whispered over their sake. However, what Naotaka was most wary of was not Nobunaga's cruelty. "Iron guns, is it?" Naotaka gripped the hilt of his beloved Tarodachi. They said Nobunaga was buying up massive quantities of matchlock guns introduced from the barbarians of the south, known as, quote, Tanagashima. Weapons far more powerful than bows and arrows, capable of piercing even armor. They said he was arming hundreds, thousands of foot soldiers with them. Are honed muscles and polished sword skills to be nullified by a single lead ball? For Naotaka, who lived by martial arts, it was a change in the times he did not want to acknowledge. The only hope for the Asakura family was their alliance with the Azai family of Omi. The young head of the Azai clan, Azai Nagamasa, was known as a good man of strong loyalty. Nagamasa had taken Nobunaga's sister Oichi as his wife, and was in an alliance with the Oda. In other words, the Azai family was connected to both the Asakura and the Oda. This delicate triangular relationship barely maintained the peace of Ekizen. However, the balance crumbled all too easily. Nobunaga, who had installed the shogun in Kyoto, ordered Asakura Yoshikage to come to the capital and pay respects. It was a humiliating demand, tantamount to treating the prestigious Asakura family as a vassal. There was no way the high-pride Yoshikage would comply. Upstart, don't get carried away. Yoshikage's refusal gave Nobunaga the pretext to invade Ekizen. Finally, the great Oda army began to move toward Echizen. The reaction of the Asakura forces attempting to intercept them was slow, and border castles fell one after another. Naotaka stood on the front lines, but the enemy's momentum was tremendous, forcing a defensive battle. Quote, "At this rate, each Yodani will be a sea of fire." Just when everyone was resigned to defeat, the situation changed abruptly. Azai Nagamasa, who had remained silent, betrayed Nobunaga and assaulted the Oda army from behind. "Lord Nagamasa has risen," the news greatly emboldened the Asakura army. Asakura in front, Azai behind. A perfect pincer attack. Even for Nobunaga, escape from this desperate encirclement should have been impossible. The desperate retreat battle known as the Retreat of Kanagasaki began. The Oda army, which had been the hunter, suddenly became the hunted. In the end, Nobunaga barely escaped to Kyoto with only a few men. Serves him right. Even the Oda is not an undefeated god. Relief and ridicule spread through the Asakura camp. That demon king had fled covered in mud. Naotaka also sighed in relief. He is human too. If cut, he bleeds and dies. It was the moment vague terror turned into a tangible enemy to be defeated. However, Naotaka's brother, Naozumi, looked pale. "Brother, don't celebrate just yet. A tiger is most frightening when it is wounded." Indeed, they let Nobunaga escape. They didn't kill him. Upon returning to Kyoto, Nobunaga immediately reorganized his forces and swore revenge on the Azai and Asakura who had betrayed him. Next time he came, it would not be with a half-hearted force like before. An enraged demon was coming to devour the entire country. The season shifted to summer. The humid wind carried an ominous premonition. The allied forces of Oda and Tokugawa began moving north again. Their target was the Azai family's headquarters, Odani Castle. If this fell, it was clear the Asakura family would fall with it. There was no longer anywhere to run, nor any room for discussion. Do or die, it was one or the other. "Move out!" Asakura Yoshikage finally raised his heavy frame. The entire Asakura army moved to rescue their ally, the Azai family. Their numbers were around 10,000. A long procession filled the highway leading from Ichijo-deni. The faces of the soldiers no longer held the optimistic color of the past, but were stained with grim determination. Naotaka burned with fighting spirit quietly within the procession. The Tarodachi on his back felt heavier than usual. It was not the weight of fear, but the weight of responsibility. If he crumbled, the unit would crumble. If the unit crumbled, the Asakura would crumble. "I will support them with this sword," he murmured in his heart repeatedly, stepping firmly on the ground one step at a time. The destination for the decisive battle was Anagawa, a wide, shallow river in the Azai territory. There, the great army of Oda and Tokugawa lay in wait. The rumored musket corps and Nobunaga in his barbarian cloak. They should all be there. "It is time, brother," Naozumi said quietly, walking beside him. Naotaka nodded silently and slapped his brother's shoulder powerfully. Dark clouds hung in the sky. Thunder roared in the distance. Was it the labor pains to end the Sengoku period, or the sound of destruction? The curtain was about to rise on the Battle of Anagawa, a great clash that would remain in history. Naotaka took a deep breath. filling the depths of his lungs with the air of the battlefield. Whether a demon appears or a snake appears, he would simply cut it down. On June 28th of the first year of Genki, the coalition of Asakura and Azai forces took their positions across the Anagawa River, facing off against the Oda and Tokugawa alliance. The water was shallow, barely deep enough to wade through. This meant that the moment either side took a step, the battle would instantly descend into a chaotic, muddy melee. Only the sound of the flowing river resonated eerily. The murderous intent of tens of thousands from both armies clashed silently above the water's surface. Showing no signs of fatigue from the march, Naotaka sat heavily in the center of the formation. For an ordinary samurai, simply wearing heavy armor for a long time would drain their stamina. However, for Naotaka, this heavy equipment was like everyday clothing. The tarodachi on his back felt as familiar as a part of his own body. His calm demeanor served as the sole spiritual pillar for his allied soldiers driven by anxiety. "If Lord Megara is with us, we will manage somehow," the soldiers whispered to one another, trying to suppress their fear. However, Naotaka himself was not optimistic. Across the river, he could see the enemy encampments lined up in perfect order. The Oda formation had no gaps, and the Tokugawa deployment was solid as a rock. The air of a total war, completely different in dimension from the skirmishes until now, hung over the field. Night fell. It was a muggy evening during a break in the rainy season. Countless bonfires were lit in the camps of both armies. The myriad fires floating in the darkness looked like a starry sky descended to earth. But there was not a shred of romance in the atmosphere. Soldiers stuffed rice balls into their cheeks, but their eyes were not smiling. Would I be alive at this time tomorrow? Everyone repeated that question silently in their minds. Naotaka gathered around a single bonfire with his brother Naozumi and his heir Takamoto. The firewood crackled and popped. The brothers, who usually exchanged jokes, were sparse with their words tonight. Young Takamoto rubbed his hands together incessantly on his lap. Was it shivers of excitement or fear? For a young man in his early 20s, this atmosphere was far too heavy. "Father," unable to bear the silence, Takamoto spoke. "Will tomorrow's battle be difficult after all?" Naotaka poked the fire with a thick branch and answered in a low voice. "Aye, the enemy is desperate. If we don't fight with the intent to die, we will be devoured." At those words, Takamoto's face stiffened. The reality of the word death pressed against his throat. Naotaka stopped his hand and stared intently at his son's face. Then he spoke quietly. "Takamoto, are you afraid?" Takamoto hesitated for a moment, but nodded honestly. "Yes, I cannot stop my legs from shaking." To his ashamed son, Naotaka offered a smile that was surprisingly gentle. "That is good. Those who do not know fear are the first to die." His brother Naozumi also nodded quietly and added his words. "Takamoto, it is as brother says, do not rush for glory. Think first of surviving." Naotaka took a small cloth bag from his chest and handed it to his son. Inside was a charm from their hometown shrine. "Listen well. A samurai's duty is not to die." Naotaka's voice grew strong. "If the battle turns bad, I do not mind if you run." Takamoto looked up in surprise. "Run, you say? Isn't that the shame of a samurai?" "No," Naotaka asserted. "To live, protect the house, and pass on the bloodline. That is the greatest loyalty. Do not die a dog's death." It was the final teaching, entrusted to a son by a father, living as a demon of the battlefield, but speaking as a parent. Takamoto looked alternately at his father's large hand and the charm, then nodded strongly. "I will engrave it on my heart." The fear from moments ago had vanished from his son's eyes. They were the eyes of a man who had found his resolve. Naruto nodded in satisfaction and gazed at the fire again. As a parent, he had said what he could. The rest was up to fate. The night deepened. After a short nap, Naotaka woke before dawn. The area was wrapped in thick morning mist. The view was pure white, visibility 0 beyond a few meters. The cool humidity chilled his flushed body. "Wake up! It's time!" At Naotaka's voice, Naozumi and Takamoto sprang up. The sound of armor rubbing together began to be heard from all around. The Asakura army numbered 10,000, the Azai 8,000. Opposing them, the Oda and Tokugawa alliance was said to be nearly 30,000 strong. They were outnumbered, so they had to compensate with terrain and morale. The Megara unit was placed on the very front line. "I won't yield the honor of the first spear." Naotaka tightened the cords of his helmet and hoisted the Terodachi onto his shoulder. In that instant, the air around him transformed. From beyond the mist, the sound of a conch shell echoed. The low, bellowing sound, boo, resonated in the pit of the stomach. The enemy seemed to be moving as well. The mist gradually thinned, and the scenery on the opposite bank came hazily into view. Dark shadows were lined up tightly. As the wind blew and the mist cleared, countless banners were revealed fluttering in the breeze. The Moku melon crest of the Oda family. The Mitsuba Oe hollyhock crest of the Tokugawa family. Colorful flags flapped in the morning wind. "So they've come," Naotaka muttered. "The enemy must be able to see them as well. How did they view the figure of a large man carrying a giant sword? As a monster, or as a perfect target?" To Naotaka's left was his brother Naozumi, surveying the battlefield with calm eyes. To his right was his son Takamoto, his face flushed with tension and excitement, and behind him were the elites who had believed in him and followed him. "Let's go," Naotaka shouted. "Oh!" A reply came from the depths of their bellies. Thick clouds of dust rising, the sound of running feet. The scene from the prologue was now moving as reality. Naotaka gripped the hilt of the Terodachi tightly with both hands. He felt no weight. Power surged from the core of his body. Today, in this place, he would carve the proof that a man named Megara Naotaka lived. The Tokugawa vanguard entered the river. Mounted warriors charged in, kicking up splashes of water. "Fire!" With someone's command, arrows and bullets rained down. It was the signal for the battle to begin. Naotaka exhaled deeply and smiled ferociously. Now, let it begin. The banquet of blood. The surface of the Anagawa River sparkled, reflecting the morning sun. However, that brilliance would soon be dyed red, a battle described in only a few lines in history books. Yet, there were certainly men there who burned their lives. Naotaka took a large step forward. The giant sword groaned as it tore through the sky. The first enemy entered Naotaka's range. It was a foot soldier holding a spear. His fear-stricken face appeared in slow motion. Naotaka swung the Terodachi down without hesitation. A roar! Without even time to scream, the enemy soldier was blown away. This was the first result of the Megara unit in the Battle of Anagawa. "I am Megara Naotaka, and I push forward." His thunderous self-introduction roared across the battlefield. It was the soul cry of a man diving into a place of death. Oda or Tokugawa, it didn't matter. He would simply cut down the enemy before him and move forward. The legendary day, soaked in blood, opened its curtains. The Battle of Anagawa consisted of two major battlefronts. In the east, the Azai army clashed with the Oda army, and in the west, the Asakura army collided with the Tokugawa army. Megara Naotaka was on the very front line of this anti-Tokugawa front. The Mikawa warrior band, led by Tokugawa Ieyasu, was an elite force known for their fierce courage. Fearing no death, they crossed the river shouting war cries. "Here they come, brace yourselves!" Naotaka's voice rang out. In the next moment, the vanguards of both armies crashed violently. Crash! A tremendous metallic sound drowned out the river's noise. Spears struck spears, and men pushed men in a scrum of death. Normally, it would be impossible to wield a great sword in this dense formation. He would hit his allies. However, Naotaka was different. He stepped forward, several paces ahead of the front line. He plunged alone into the midst of the enemy. "Step up if you want to die!" The Terodachi flashed in a horizontal sweep. The effective range of that blow was over 3 meters around him. The moment enemy soldiers tried to thrust their spears, they were swept away. Spears, arms, torsos, and all. Following the sound of cutting wind, whoosh, came the thudding sounds of things falling. With one swing from Naotaka, 3 Tokugawa soldiers rolled on the ground. The cross-sections, cut diagonally from the shoulders of their armor, looked as if tofu had been sliced with a sharp razor. Woo! What is this guy? The following enemy soldiers stopped in their tracks at the sheer horror. It was not the power of a sword wielded by a human. Naotaka did not stop. Returning the blade, he swung from right to left this time. The lump of iron, riding centrifugal force, accelerated and increased its destructive power. Enemy helmets shattered, and shields blew away like scrap paper. In the wake of the Terodachi, only empty space and a mist of blood remained. A gaping void of death was born only around Megara Naotaka. "Ora, ora, ora!" Naotaka's roar thundered. The gentleman of usual times was nowhere to be found. His blood boiled, and he entered a state of excitement where his vision was dyed red, a so-called berserker state. Despite swinging a heavy sword, his breath was not disordered in the slightest. Adrenaline made him forget fatigue. His brother Naozumi and his son Takamoto guarded Naotaka's flanks perfectly. They surely finished off enemies who jumped in, aiming for the slight gap after Naotaka attacked. "I won't let you take father's back." Takamoto's spear pierced an enemy soldier's throat, an ironclad fortress created by the coordination of parent, child, and siblings. The Tokugawa army could not break through this Megara wall no matter what. From the perspective of the foot soldiers on the enemy Tokugawa side, it was a nightmare. A black giant appeared from across the river, knocking people away like sticks. "Don't get close! If you get close, you'll be cut in two." Fear was contagious, and the Tokugawa front line began to inch back. Even the brave Mikawa warriors had to hesitate before this unreasonable violence. On the other hand, for the Ashigaru of the Asakura army, Naotaka's back was a shining hope. "Follow Lord Megara. If we stay behind him, we're safe." The giant carved open a path, and allies flooded into that road of blood. In the early stages, the battle situation was clearly in favor of the Asakura army. The valor of Naotaka alone had raised the morale of the entire army to its limit. The river water had already turned a muddy brown, discolored by dirt and blood. Enemy corpses piled up at Naotaka's feet. He stepped over them, trying to advance further. His target was Tokugawa Ieyasu's main camp. If he took the general's head, this battle would end. However, the goddess of the battlefield was capricious. The calamity arose from the right flank. A detached force of the Tokugawa army, led by Sakakibara Yasumasa, struck the side of the Asakura army. Furthermore, a part of the Oda army that had been fighting the Azai army began a pincer attack on the Asakura forces. "The right wing has collapsed!" A scream-like report was heard. The Asakura army, which should have been riding momentum, could not withstand the shock from the side and fell into chaos. Naotaka, who had been pushing forward and forward, also noticed his allies had stopped. "What's wrong? Push!" Looking back, he saw the allied formation was distorted. Terrified soldiers had begun to back away. "Don't run! Stand your ground!" Naotaka's voice was drowned out by the din of the battlefield and did not reach them. It was the moment the tide changed. The wave that had been pushing turned into a receding tide. The Tokugawa army regained its breath and surged forward, relying on numbers. Even if he defeated 10 men alone, 20 were immediately replenished. No matter how powerful Naotaka's Tarodachi was, he could not cut down all of the inexhaustibly springing enemies. Cling, a dull sound rang out. Countless small chips had appeared on the blade of the great sword. "Father, it is dangerous to go further," Takamoto shouted, his face pale. "The main unit is retreating." Looking back, they could see the flag of the Asakura main camp slowly turning around. It was a total rout. At this rate, only the Megara unit would be isolated in the midst of the enemy. Naotaka ground his teeth. Just a little more, and he might have reached Ieyasu's head. However, Naotaka was calm. For the entire army to escape, someone had to serve as the Shingari, the rear guard, and hold back the enemy. The rear guard is the most dangerous and honorable role, becoming a sacrificial stone to let allies escape. "Takamoto, Naozumi, we remain here." Naotaka's voice was quiet, but filled with a determination as immovable as a rock. The two understood their brothers, their father's intent instantly. Understood, yes. No useless words were needed. The Megara unit stood their ground against the wave of fleeing allies. Like a single stake standing in the middle of the river, they became a wall accepting the great wave of the rushing Tokugawa army head-on. The number of enemies had swollen to more than double what it was before. Spears were thrust from all directions. Naotaka continued to spin the Tarodachi like a windmill. Megara Naotaka defends the Asakura retreat. His figure was no longer human, but like a Neo-Guardian statue dyed red with blood. He had long passed his physical limit. Only his pride as a samurai kept him moving. The murmur of the Anagawa had turned completely the color of blood. This is the scene of the river of blood that would be passed down to posterity. Watching the backs of his allies recede, Naotaka smirked. Enemy soldiers filled his vision. It was a desperate situation, yet strangely there was no fear. Is this my place to die? Not bad. He readjusted his grip on the sword and stepped forward for his final rampage. The Megara unit, having become a shield to let their allies escape, was swallowed in the blink of an eye by the sea of the Tokugawa army. Yet, at the center of the storm, Naotaka alone did not sink. It was as if a barrier of death had been erected around him, preventing anyone from drawing near. "I am Megara Jirozema Naotaka." Upon hearing his name, a single young warrior burst forth from the Tokugawa ranks. A man wearing a helmet adorned with stag antlers, wielding the legendary spear Tanbokiri, the dragonfly cutter. This was Honda Tadakatsu, the future head of the 4 heavenly kings of the Tokugawa. This fierce general, then still in his early 20s, did not flinch even upon seeing Naotaka's giant frame. "I challenge you!" Tadakatsu's spear thrust out, aiming for Naotaka's throat. Naotaka parried it with his great sword, sending sparks flying. The power of Megara versus the speed of Honda. The intensity was enough to silence the battlefield for a moment. The giant great sword and the Godspeed spear. The two lethal weapons crossed paths time and again. When Naotaka swung his sword down, Tadakatsu twisted his body to dodge and thrust his spear into the opening. It was truly a battle of a dragon against a tiger. The surrounding soldiers forgot to fight, captivated by the duel. Amidst the bloody slaughter, it was a miraculously beautiful moment. Or, so the later war chronicles and storytelling traditions dramatically recount, a duel between hero and hero. People likely projected their dreams onto this story, wondering what would happen if these two fought. However, the battlefield of reality was far more cruel and merciless. In truth, Naotaka was fighting alone against countless enemies continuously. "Surround him! Stop his movement!" Skilled warriors of the Tokugawa army, such as Sakisaka Yoshimasa and the Aoki brothers, attacked Naotaka one after another. It was not one-on-one. It was a cowardly war of attrition, one against many. Yet, Naotaka did not utter a single complaint, simply swinging his sword like a machine. "Get out of my way!" With spirit alone, he mowed down the swarming enemies. But his limits were certainly approaching. The blade of the Terodachi was chipped and ragged, and Naotaka's armor was bloodied from countless wounds. Every time he breathed with his heaving shoulders, he felt a heat as if his lungs were burning. Still, he did not fall because there was something behind him he had to protect. "Father!" At that moment, his son Takamoto, who had been fighting beside him, stepped forward to shield Naotaka. An enemy spear pierced Takamoto's body. "Ji-yu! Ah!" The young warrior looked back at his father and smiled faintly. "I go, ahead of you." Takamoto collapsed and moved no more. "Takamoto!" Naotaka's scream echoed across the battlefield. His son, more precious to him than his own life, had scattered before his eyes. Tears overflowed from Naotaka's eyes, instantly turning into flames of rage. "You bastards!" He smashed the enemy soldier who pierced Takamoto, armor and all. A demon god! His figure was the very definition of the word. But the tragedy continued. His brother Nozomi, too, after protecting his brother's back to the very end, ran out of strength and fell. "Brother, the rest is up to you." The brother who was always calm passed away while worrying about Naotaka until his final moment. His son, his brother, his subordinates, they were all dead. Naotaka was alone. The solitary giant stood still in the sea of blood, yet the fighting spirit had not vanished from his eyes. Rather, they held a clear, serene silence. "I will join you there soon, but not yet. I will take as many of them as possible with me to the underworld." Naotaka threw away the heavy Terodachi. The blade was too damaged to swing any longer. He drew the wakizashi, short sword, at his waist and grabbed an enemy soldier's neck with his bare hand. Even without a weapon, his entire body was a lethal instrument. Finally, the moment came. Spears, thrust from 4 directions, pierced Naotaka's massive body simultaneously. A dull thud resonated within him. There was no pain, just a sensation of his body suddenly becoming heavy, and the ground rushing up to meet him. "Splendid!" Naotaka muttered briefly, as if praising the enemy soldiers who had stabbed him. Like a giant tree felling, Naotaka slowly dropped to his knees, then fell onto his back. The cloudy sky filled his vision. Across that sky he saw a single bird flying leisurely. How free it is! Within his fading consciousness he thought of such things. The din of war sounded like the distant roar of the ocean. Moving his neck slightly, he saw the muddy surface of the Anagawa. The river dyed red. Beyond it he could see the backs of the Asakura army growing smaller. They escaped. Good. In exchange for his own life, many comrades survived. A satisfied smile floated onto his lips. "My son, my brother, I kept you waiting. I am coming now." Naotaka's vision slowly darkened, as if the curtain of a stage were falling. Born in a northern mountain village, living with a giant sword, the man's life ended here. The sound of the Anagawa River rang gently, like a requiem for him. The Battle of Anagawa ended in victory for the Oda Tokugawa army. Afterwards, both the Azai and Asakura families tumbled down the slope to ruin. 3 years later, in the first year of Tensho, the glorious Ichijodani suffered Nobunaga's fire attack and burned for 3 days and 3 nights. The beautiful little Kyoto of the Hokuriku was reduced to ashes, and the prestigious Asakura clan was finally destroyed. The lord and the country Naotaka risked his life to protect, vanished into the flames of the era. So, was the Megara lineage completely extinguished there? In fact, an interesting ancient document remains. After the war, a letter was issued acknowledging land ownership to a person named Megara Kasuke. Major warriors like Naotaka, Naozumi, and Takamoto fell at Anagawa. But perhaps someone left behind inherited that blood and family name, quietly surviving the Warring States period. And there is one more thing left behind. The very soul of Naotaka, that Tarodachi. Currently, a single giant great sword is dedicated to the treasure hall of Atsuta Shrine in Nagoya City, Aichi Prefecture. Total length, 221 centimeters. Weight, 4.5 kilograms. That lump of iron, viewed through a glass case, holds an extraordinary intensity even to modern eyes. According to legend, this is the very sword Megara Naotaka wielded at Enegawa. Also, the sword said to be used to take his head still exists under the name Megara-giri, the Megara cutter. Those steels, remaining without rust, speak silently of the fierce battle from that day across 450 years. Witnessing them in person, one feels a presence that sends chills down the spine. How shocking must the existence of Megara Naotaka have been to the people of that time? It was an era when the average height of men was less than 160 centimeters. Into that world, a 2-meter giant appeared, lightly swinging a great sword like a laundry-drying pole. It must have looked less like a scene from reality and more like a scene from mythology. That is why even the enemy soldiers of Tokugawa and Oda passed down his story with a sense of awe. He was defeated. The victors of history were Oda Nobunaga and Tokugawa Ieyasu. However, the memory of that overwhelming individual strength remained, crossing the boundaries of victory and defeat. In storytelling, in woodblock prints, and in modern games and novels, Megara Naotaka continues to rampage in people's hearts as the strongest hero.